Oh, whoops, must have been a little feedback. I had it on the computer. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you on a Tuesday night. It's going to be a busy daf tonight. Lots of Mishnas covered. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to cover some beautiful content on a Tuesday? It's Tuesday. It's got to be Tuesday. Stephen in New Hampshire, Renee in Indiana, Paula in Chicago, Nancy, North Carolina, John in Maine, James in Indianapolis, Bill in mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Gwen in Michigan, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, Tom in PA, Lisa in Vancouver, Sharon still in Las Vegas last night there, Leona in Southern Illinois, Paula, so happy to see you. Couldn't find you yesterday. Oh dear. Definitely want to go back and catch that. All the episodes of AT Daily are on our website, accidentaltalmudist.org, in the AT Daily section. Tom, not sure how much I'll be able to attend the rest of the year as I'll be on vacation, and you deserve a vacation. But maybe you could make up the pages when you get back. Frank in LA, Pauline in Arkansas. Alice on the right coast, so to speak, in Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome, everybody. That song during the warm-up music was a rock and roll version of Adir Hu, a Passover song. That was from Soul Farm, which is C. Lansbaum and Noah Solomon. And that song appears on the soundtrack of our movie, When Do We Eat? Great to have you with us. Very quick, it's our annual campaign. We're winding down, only 10 days to go till the end of the year. We're 60% of the way to our budget for the coming year and enabling us to build the AT app. So if you haven't joined in, join this mitzvah with massive impact. Nina will put the link in the comments, but it's donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. We are honoring our close friend, dear departed friend Moti Kest, who just loved Torah and Torah study. And this is going to be the AT app in memory of Moti Kest, Zichrono Livraha. May his memory always be for a blessing. There's going to be a special Parsha section where we're going to look to rabbis offering commentary that were Moti's favorite rabbis. It's going to be amazing. For AT Daily, it's going to be especially amazing. You'll get custom notifications, however you want to arrange it on your smart device. If you watch it later, you'll have the ability to speed it up. Maybe I don't talk fast enough for you, but maybe you could even slow it down. You'll have that ability in the app. So please join our campaign. Remember that the only dollars you can take with you into the next world are the ones on your canceled checks that you gave to good causes. We are holding on daf, and it's a double daf tonight. Oh, that's why, of course, I wasn't there last night. We did daf 7, which was a key daf, an amazing story on Sunday night. I was away yesterday. Excuse me, what am I talking about? It's not that you were away, it's that I was away. I was giving a talk to a group based in New York via Zoom, and I shared 2 stories that we had in Tractate Tainus. There was just, it was great. It was great to be able to do those stories back to back and to look for common ground between the story of Nachum Ish Gamzu, Nachum who says this too is for the good, and Honi the circle maker. We covered those on pages 21 and 23 of Tractate Tainus. When you sort of remove them and just look at the stories themselves and study them together, it's a really good talk. If anybody wants to invite me to their community and I can give that talk, I'd be happy to do it. Okay, tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Gail Har, and I apologize, I should have done it a couple nights ago. And Gail says, I'd like to save my dedication until December 18th, when it will be in honor of the bat mitzvah of Hannah Har, daughter of Matthew and Haley Har, and granddaughter of Gail and Robert Har. So Hannah was converted as an infant. Her mother was not born Jewish, but has been an active and interested party to Hannah's Jewish family life and education. beautiful, Gail. It's wonderful that you can see Jewish values being transmitted to the next generation and the next generation after that. May you and all your loved ones, especially Hannah on the occasion of her bar mitzvah, be showered in blessings, and we say amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people. Right, so tonight it's a double daf. We're covering pages 8 and 9. Now we're here in Tractate Megillah, the 11th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Purim, and we've entered a section here where the Mishna, the plural, the Mishnayos, are sort of riffing on this idea. We started with a Mishnah that said the only difference between Purim observed in the first Adar or in the second Adar in a Jewish leap year is such, and noted just the small differences between those days in Adar 1 and Adar 2. And having gone there, now, often we see digressions in the Gemara, but not in the Mishnah. The Mishnah tends to stay on topic. But now the Mishnah is digressing, Mishnah after Mishnah after Mishnah, just based on this structure. The only difference between two things that are kind of similar is such, and in every other way, they're totally the same. And so tonight, very unusual, sometimes we do one Mishnah and we study Gemaras on that Mishnah for 2 weeks, I think even 3 weeks. We might have even done a month on one Mishnah at some point. But tonight, we're going to cover 7 Mishnahs in one night. So hold on to your seats. Needless to say, there's sort of 2 long pages, but we're not going to cover all of the Gemaras on these Mishnahs, but we will cover all the Mishnahs and some of the Gemara commentary on the Mishnah. So let's get into it. Right at the top of page 8, Amud Aleph on the A side of page 8, Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Megillah. The difference between one for whom benefit from another is forbidden by vow and one for whom benefit from another's food is forbidden by vow is only with regard to stepping foot on his property and with regard to borrowing utensils from him that one does not use in the preparation of food, but for other purposes, as those two benefits are prohibited to the former but permitted to the latter. So a person can take a vow that I'm not going to benefit from another person. I'm not going to take anything from that person, and a person takes a vow that he will not take anything, he will not benefit in any way from another person, versus I will not benefit from his food. And it seems, according to this Mishnah, that the only difference is that you can't walk across his property or use utensils that are not for food purposes. That would be the only difference between those two. Gemara on that, the Gemara infers that with regard to the matter of utensils that one uses in the preparation of food, okay, so both this, the one who vowed that any benefit is forbidden, and that, the one who vowed that benefit from food is forbidden, are equal, right? If I said I can't benefit from his food, I also can't benefit from the utensils that he uses in food preparation. And it is prohibited for both to derive benefit from utensils used in the preparation of food. Both of these persons who took a vow, whether any benefit or just benefit from his food. And the Mishnah stated that for one for whom benefit from another is forbidden by vow, stepping foot on the latter's property is prohibited. And Gemara asks, what benefit is that? Aren't people not particular about other people walking on their property? Right? So, am I really going to care if this guy walks across the corner of my lawn? Is he really benefiting from me if he walks across the corner of my lawn? And Rava said, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah taught? It is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said, overlooking is prohibited in the case of one for whom benefit is forbidden by vow. For one for whom benefit from another person is forbidden because of a vow that he took, benefit remains forbidden even in matters with regard to which a person typically is not particular and overlooks the other's use of his property, for instance, stepping foot on it. So you say, take a vow, you're not going to benefit from that guy, so you can't even walk across the corner of his lawn. That's Mishnah number 6. Now, that was the Gemara, Mishnah 6. Now, Mishnah number 7. The difference between animals consecrated to the temple as vow offerings and animals consecrated as gift offerings is only in the case of vow offerings that if they died or were lost before being sacrificed on the altar, one is obligated in the responsibility to replace them. And in the case of gift offerings, if they died or were lost, one is not obligated in the responsibility to replace them. These are ola offerings, an offering that's going to be entirely consumed on the altar when the temple is standing. So if you say it is incumbent on me to bring an ola at the temple, okay, then even if you were thinking about a particular animal, you just said, I'm going to bring an offering. So that animal is lost, then you have to replace that animal because you took a vow to bring that offering. If, on the other hand, you say, I'm going to bring that animal as an offering or as a gift offering, and that animal dies or is stolen, okay, so now you're exempt. You don't have to replace it because all you said was you're going to bring that animal, and now you're not able to bring that animal, but you're not obligated to replace it. You might still want to replace it, but not because of the vow that you took. That's Mishnah number 7. Here's the Gemara. The Gemara infers that with regard to the matter of the prohibition, do not be slack to pay one's pledges. Both this, a vow offering, and that, a gift offering, are equal. If one delayed bringing either a vow offering or a gift offering, he violates the prohibition. And we discussed elsewhere that when do you become liable for having delayed too long? I think it was when a whole cycle of pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, passes in order. If all three go by between when you made this vow and when you brought it, so now you have violated your vow, right? You transgressed the vow that you made. And that's going to count whether it's a vow offering or a gift offering. And we learned in a Mishnah there, which is the case of a vow offering. It is one who says, it is incumbent upon me to bring a burnt offering. And what is the case of a gift offering? It is one who says, this animal is a burnt offering. And what is the difference between a vow offering and a gift offering? As we said, with regard to vow offerings, if the animals died or were stolen or were lost, the one who vowed is obligated in the responsibility to replace them, as he undertook to bring a burnt offering, and he is not absolved of his obligation until he brings the offering. And with regard to gift offerings, however, if the animals died or were stolen or were lost, the one who vowed is not obligated in the responsibility to replace them. Right, so we don't bring animal offerings since the temple was destroyed. We hope that we will have that ability again when the Mashiach comes and the temple is restored. And it may be that when the Messiah comes back and the temple is rebuilt, we don't have to bring animal offerings because animal sacrifice was just something that was particular to a historical time period, and it won't be restored in the future. Our sages dispute that, right? Maimonides, I believe, said we won't be bringing animal offerings. Many other classical Jewish commentators say we will be bringing animal offerings. No point in arguing about it. We won't know until Mashiach comes. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? The difference between a vow offering and a gift offering? And the Gemara answers, it is as the sages taught in a Baraisa with regard to a burnt offering, that the verse states, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement upon him. Rabbi Shimon says, that which is incumbent upon him, i.e., which he accepted as a personal obligation, he does not bear responsibility to replace it if it died or was stolen. However, that which is not incumbent upon him, i.e., that which he did not accept as a personal obligation, but which he designated as an offering, he does not bear responsibility to replace it. And the Gemara asks, from where may the conclusion be inferred from this verse? And Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, since he said, it is incumbent upon me to bring a burnt offering, he is considered as one who bears it on his shoulders. And the expression upon me indicates an assumption of responsibility to bring an offering. Now, spiritually speaking, though we don't bring offerings these days, we do take upon ourselves obligations to donate to righteous causes, right? And so if you're fulfilling a tithing responsibility, if you're fulfilling a responsibility to promote Torah study in the world, or to feed the hungry, or to shelter the homeless, and you tell some charitable organization that you're going to give, yes, so now it's incumbent upon you to fulfill that pledge. And you should take it as seriously as these offerings are taken there. Mishnah number 8. The difference between a zav who experiences 2 emissions of a pus-like discharge. All right, what is a zav before we complete this Mishnah? Okay, a zav. Okay, what I wanted to read. Okay, so the zav is mentioned in the Torah. And, this is like kind of a little icky, and we don't talk about it that much, although there's a whole tractate in the Talmud that we're going to come to. But the idea is that a man has a discharge from his organ. And what sort of discharge is it? So the discharge of a zav is apparently the discharge of the modern day condition of gonorrhea. It's not a normal seminal emission. There's also, treated in halakha, in Jewish law, what to do when the temple is standing and you become impure due to a seminal emission, just a normal seminal emission. But the emission of a zav is, it sort of connotes that there's also some kind of a malady in the man. So after one contracts the disease, pus begins to discharge from his sexual organ, followed by a discharge of mucus. And in the Tosefta and the Gemara, the differences between a seminal emission and the emission of a zav are delineated. The severe impurity of the zav and his exacting purification process are detailed in the Torah, Leviticus 15, verses 1 through 15, and in the Mishnah in Tractate Zavim. So although a woman can also contract this disease, a fact acknowledged in the Talmud, only a male becomes impure with the symptoms of a zav. A woman becomes impure with the impurity of a zava by experiencing a flow of blood, menstrual blood, that is not during her period. The terms are similar, but the conditions that lead to them are totally dissimilar. So now we're talking about the zav, the man. And the difference between a zav who experiences 2 emissions of a pus-like discharge from his organ and one who experiences 3 emissions is only that the zav who experienced 3 emissions is obligated to bring an offering after he recovers in order to complete his purification process. If you're curious about more about the purification process of the zav and how we define that and how we arrive at the differences between one who has seen 2 emissions and one who has seen 3 emissions, I invite you to read that on your own. We're actually, because we're covering 2 pages tonight, we're going to skip the Gemaras on Mishnah number 8, and we're going to go right to Mishnah number 9. We're covering 7 Mishnahs tonight. The difference between a quarantined leper. Now remember, when we're translating leper, we're talking about the metzora, somebody suffering from tzaraas. That is not what we understand today as leprosy, terrible disease where people's limbs kind of rot while on their bodies and eventually fall off. Here we're talking about ritual leprosy, and that was an outbreak on the skin, but it's a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, and our sages elsewhere connect that malady to the sin of lashon hara, gossiping, evil tongue, speaking about others in an inappropriate manner. So somebody who's a metzora, somebody who has this condition of tzaraas, versus somebody who might have tzaraas. That's what we're talking about here. The difference between a quarantined leper, what is that? One who was examined by a priest, right? When the temple was standing and tzaraas existed, we don't have tzaraas anymore. It doesn't exist in the world anymore. But when it did, you would go get yourself, when you thought you might have it, you would go get yourself examined, not by a doctor, because it's not a physical sickness. It's a spiritual malady that manifests in a physical way. So you would go get yourself examined by a Kohen, by a priest, so if one was examined by the priest who found his symptoms to be inconclusive, so he must therefore remain in isolation for a period of up to 2 weeks, waiting to see if conclusive symptoms develop, or if they don't, and then he's going to say, no, you're not a metzora. So he's isolated for 2 weeks. So the difference between the quarantine leper who's waiting to see if he really has it or not, versus the confirmed metzora, i.e. one whose symptoms were conclusive and the priest declared him a metzora, is only, the difference between these is only with regard to letting the hair on one's head grow wild and rending one's garments, right, which you do when somebody dies. But you also do it if you're a confirmed metzora. So a confirmed metzora is obligated to let the hair on his head grow wild and rip his garments. The quarantine leper is not. The difference between a leper who's purified from quarantine, right? So after he finishes the time of his quarantine, he goes through a purification process. Even though his symptoms never became conclusive, he still has to go through a process. The difference between that process and the confirmed metzora who goes through a purification process, the only difference between those two purification processes is with regard to shaving the hair all over his body and bringing birds as purification offerings. Those obligations are only incumbent upon the confirmed metzora. If you want to know more about the laws of becoming a metzora and purification from a metzora, and you can't wait until we come to that volume in the Talmud, you could read these Gemaras. We are skipping forward. We're now near the end of the B side of page 8. Mishna number 10. The difference between Torah scrolls and tefillin and mezuzahs, right? So tefillin, the black straps that I wrap around my arm in the morning, and the one I put on my forehead, the straps are connected to two black boxes. One goes between my eyes, another goes on my arm. All Jewish men are obligated to put those on every day that's not Shabbos or festival. And what's in those black boxes are scrolls of parchment with verses from the Torah. What's in a mezuzah that we put on the doorways of our homes? Inside, there's a scroll, a parchment with a verse from the Torah. So the difference between actual Torah scrolls and the scrolls that are inside tefillin and inside mezuzahs, in terms of the manner in which those scrolls are written, is only that Torah scrolls may be written in any language, we'll come back to that, whereas tefillin and mezuzahs are written only in Ashurit, i.e. Hebrew, and using the Hebrew script. What's interesting here is what they're referring to as Ashurit is Hebrew and Hebrew letters the way we know them today. So the beautiful calligraphy of Hebrew lettering was actually a little bit later, right? The Ten Commandments and the original Torah was written in an earlier script, which in fact the Samaritans still use today, but at some point in our history, it was replaced by this later, development of what we call the modern Hebrew script. I mean, it's still 2,500 years old or more, probably more. But so it's quite ancient, but it is a little bit newer than the original script of the Bible. So when we're talking, but it's this script that we still use today is the only script that's valid for the scrolls that are in tefillin or in a mezuzah on the door, and also for a Torah scroll. But we'll come back to that. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek, not just any language. Obviously, it could be written in Hebrew, and the only other language that a Torah scroll could be written in, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, was Greek. And we're going to come to why he would say that. The law, the halacha. Tefillin and mezuzahs. Tefillin and mezuzahs may be written only in Ashurit. That is the law, meaning Hebrew the way we know it now. The Hebrew, beautiful Hebrew calligraphy, the way we know it now, that is only good. Tefillin and mezuzah can only be written in that script. The scroll on which an Aramaic verse is written in Hebrew, or a Hebrew verse is written in Aramaic, or a verse is written in the ancient Hebrew script before what we think of as the Hebrew script now, does not render the hands impure. It does so only if the scrolls are written in Ashurit on parchment with ink. So if you make a Torah scroll, in the earliest kind of Hebrew, the original Hebrew script, the language is Hebrew, but it's a script that sort of went out of use. And if you wrote a Torah scroll in that script, it would not have the sanctity of a proper Torah scroll. Here's some background on Ashurit. The Hebrew script currently in use is called by the sages Ashurit, in contrast to the ancient Hebrew script called Ivrit that is still used by the Samaritans. And the sages disagreed as to why the script is called Ashurit. Some explain that it is because the Jews brought it with them when they returned from the Babylonian exile. So after the destruction of the first temple, during the 70-year exile in Babylonia, that became Persia, and then they came back to the Holy Land and reestablished the second temple, and it would seem that that's when they brought what we think of as Hebrew script. It started at that point. Others explain that it is from the word happiness, asher, or directness, yosher, meaning an aesthetic, straightforward script. And the ancient Hebrew script is still used by Samaritans today, and this image depicts a street sign from Holon, Israel, which has a Samaritan community, and the top line is in Ashurit, and the bottom line is in Ivrit. And so let's see if I can get that close enough to the camera so that you can see it. Right? So that street sign, the upper line is Hebrew, right? The middle line is English letters, of course, and that bottom line is that original, I'm sorry about the focus, but that's the original type of script from the original Torah and Ten Commandments, and that's called Ivrit, but we don't use it anymore. It does not possess sanctity anymore. Rav Ashi said, when this Baraisa is taught with regard to the rest of the books of the Bible other than the Torah, it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. I'm skipping a bunch of clauses in the Gemara now on this Mishna to get to Rav Ashi's point. And it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in a Baraisa, tefillin and mezuzahs are written only in Ashurit, and our rabbis permitted writing them in Greek as well. And the Gemara asks, how did our rabbis permit this? Isn't it written with regard to tefillin and mezuzah at Deuteronomy 6:6, and this is part of the Shema, and these words shall be. You know, you shall inscribe them on the doorposts of your house, right? And they shall be, and you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand and as a symbol before your eyes. Okay, so how could it, and it says these words in Hebrew, so how could you possibly write them in Greek? What sage would agree to have them written in Greek? Rather, say, this is what the Baraisa is saying, Torah scrolls are written in any language, and our rabbis permitted writing them in Greek as well. Once again, the Gemara asks, are rabbis permitted? By inference, apparently, the first Tana prohibited its writing, prohibits writing a Torah scroll in Greek. However, he explicitly permits writing a Torah scroll in any language. Is this possible? And the Gemara continues, and this was due to the incident of King Ptolemy. Now, just so we know, obviously Bibles, the Hebrew Bible has been translated into many languages. That's not a problem. But the original translation, the first time that it was translated from Hebrew to another language, was to Greek. And we're going to talk about that incident in one moment. The sages were very uncomfortable with that because there's so much nuance and information. I'm thinking about how the sages break down every word, every suffix, every prefix of every word, the meaning inherent in that. As soon as you start to do a translation, you're doing an interpretation. The meaning could get lost or misconstrued or used in a way that is inappropriate and sinful. They were very concerned about translations. However, that original translation into Greek, which came to be known as the Septuagint, and we'll explain why in a moment, eventually was accorded a very high level, even of holiness, at least by Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and now we're going to learn why. So the Gemara continues. Permit only in a Torah scroll. And this was due to the incident of King Ptolemy. As it is taught in a Baraisa, there was an incident involving King Ptolemy of Egypt, who assembled 72 elders from the sages of Israel. And he put them into 72 separate rooms. I mean, he might have been the king of Egypt, but you understand this is a king of the Greek Empire that ruled over the Holy Land, and that's how he had the power to do this. So there was an incident involving King Ptolemy of Egypt, who assembled 72 elders from the sages of Israel, and he put them into 72 separate rooms, and he did not reveal to them for what purpose he assembled them, so that they would not coordinate their responses. He entered and approached each and every one and said to each of them, "Write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher." The Holy One, now they had no choice. The Holy One, blessed be He, placed wisdom in the heart of each and every one, and they all agreed to one common understanding. Not only did they translate the text correctly, but they all introduced the same changes into the translated text. And right away we start to see, as we said the other night, every translation is an interpretation. Politics come into play. If the sages of Israel are creating a Greek translation for the king of a Greek empire, and where the Torah is going to be speaking about laws pertaining to Jews and non-Jews, this could cause all kinds of problems and put them in danger. It was a miracle that they all made the exact same translation into Greek, even though they did not coordinate their responses, since they didn't know what they were going to be doing in that room when they walked in. And so what are some examples of the translation that they all did in the same way? They wrote for him, "God created in the beginning," right? Bereshit bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. The first 7 words of Genesis in Hebrew, very difficult to translate. They reversed the order of the words in that first phrase in the Torah because it could have been misinterpreted as Bereshis created God, like some creature, some entity named in the beginning created God. And so they changed it. So they did so to negate those who believe in the pre-existence of the world and those who maintain that there are 2 powers in the world and that one is Bereshis, something that existed before God existed, and that entity created the second God. And to make sure it wasn't understood that way, when they went to Greek in the Septuagint, they wrote God in the beginning creator, God created in the beginning. And they wrote, "I shall make man in image and in likeness," in the Greek, rather than the way the Hebrew puts it, which was, "Let us make man in our image and in our likeness." As from there, this plural, one could mistakenly conclude that there are multiple powers and that God has some kind of human form. Before I continue to list these examples, let me read these background notes from Rav Steinsaltz. So the Septuagint was the first translation of the Torah into a foreign language, and the sages related to the very translation of the Torah with great concern, to the extent that the day that the Septuagint was completed was designated as a fast day in Megillah's Tainus, that original publication of the days on which one should fast or which one should celebrate. Over time, the translation was accepted to a large extent as useful and significant, and as mentioned in the Mishna, it was accorded status of special significance, right? That you could write a Torah scroll in Greek and it would be holy, at least according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And among the Egyptian Jews, the Septuagint was revered and accorded great sanctity. There is an extended version of this story in Greek in the ancient letter of Aristeas, which is similar to the account related in the Gemara. And it describes the efforts of the king to organize the translation as well as the wisdom of the elders who came from Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, for that purpose. And regarding these textual changes that appear in the Septuagint was preserved. It's called the Septuagint, right, because of the 70 elders or 72 elders that made this translation and all independently worked and came up with the same translation. Septua, right, refers to 7. So the Septuagint was preserved primarily because the Christians adopted it and ascribed greater significance to it than they ascribed to the Hebrew original. Throughout the generations, the translation went through several changes, and apparently even Aquila and Symmachus, the Jewish translators, created a version more in line with the approach of halakha, Jewish law. In general, there are many differences between the source text, the original Hebrew text, and the Septuagint. And the current version contains additional passages and even entire books, like the Apocrypha. Not all of the changes cited here appear in the current version of the Septuagint, although they did appear in the versions used by the Jews when they were making use of the Greek Septuagint. So now we'll continue to list some of these differences between the Hebrew original and what the 72 translators came up with at that moment. Instead of, right in Genesis 2:2, it says, on the seventh day, God concluded his work. That's how we make Kiddush on Friday nights. And this could be understood as though some of his work was completed on Shabbos itself. So they wrote, and on the sixth day he concluded his work, and he rested on the seventh day. They also wrote, male and female, he created him. And they did not write, as is written in the Torah, male and female, he created them, to avoid the impression that there is a contradiction between this verse and the verse, and God created man at Genesis 1:27, which indicates that God created one person. Instead of, at Genesis 11:7, come, let us go down and there confound their language. That's the incident, the story of the Tower of Babel, which indicates multiple authorities. Let us go down. Normally we understand that God, in his great humility, would tell the angels around him what he was going to do, not because he was seeking their permission, but because it seemed good to God to act in that manner as an example for us. But because this might suggest to the pagan Greeks that there's some idea of multiple deities in the Jewish religion, which there's not, in the Septuagint they wrote, come, let me go down and there confound their language. In addition, they replaced the verse, and Sarah laughed within herself, Bekirba, Genesis 18:12. They replaced it with, and Sarah laughed among her relatives, Bikrovecha. They made this change to distinguish between Sarah's laughter, which God criticized, and Abraham's laughter, to which no reaction is recorded. Based on the change, Sarah's laughter was offensive because she voiced it to others. Interesting that they would do that. And they also altered the verse, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they slaughtered an ox. We just read that last week. That is the brachas, the blessings that Jacob bestows on his deathbed to his sons, the 12 sons. And he's talking there about Shimon and Levi and the incident in Shechem. And he doesn't, curse his sons, God forbid, but he does, on his deathbed, remind them that in their anger they did a terrible thing. But when it's translated to Greek, they wrote, for in their anger they slew an ox, and in their self-will they uprooted a trough, to avoid the charge that Jacob's sons were murderers. Instead of, and Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon a donkey, they wrote, and Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon a carrier of people, which could be understood as referring to a horse or a camel rather than the lowly donkey. Instead of, and the residence of the children of Israel who resided in Egypt was 430 years. If you've ever heard that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, that is false. Right? It's 400 years or 430 years is from when Abraham was told the prophecy that his children would be enslaved until they were redeemed. But the sojourn in Egypt was actually only 210 years if you count it up. So where it says, and the residence of the children of Israel who resided in Egypt was 430 years, which when read literally is imprecise, for they did not dwell in Egypt that long. The translators wrote, and the residence of the children of Israel who resided in Egypt and in other lands was 400 years. Instead of, and he sent the youth of the children of Israel who brought burnt offerings, Exodus 24:5, which evokes the question of why young men were sent to perform that service. They wrote instead, and he sent the elect, Za'alute, of the children of Israel. And the same term was substituted again several verses later, rendering the verse, and upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand, Exodus 24:11. And upon the elect of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Instead of Moses' assertion, I have not taken one donkey from them, they wrote in more general terms, I have not taken one item of value, chemed, from them, to prevent the impression that Moses might have taken anything that he wasn't entitled to when he was in a leadership position. 2, the verse that discusses the worship of the sun and the moon, about which it is written, Deuteronomy 4:19, which the Lord your God has allotted to all the nations. They added a word to make it read, which the Lord your God has allotted to give light to all the nations. Meaning, the Lord created the sun and the moon so that all of us, the whole world, all humans would benefit from its light. Not what obviously the Jews are prohibited from worshiping celestial bodies, and others are forbidden to worship celestial bodies. It's part of the Noahide laws, right? That you accept the one God. So you shouldn't think that it's okay for the other nations of the world, to be idolaters and star worshipers. And it's not okay. It's against Torah. It goes against Torah for anyone to worship the sun and the moon. And they made that clear with their translation. And in the list of unclean animals, this is like very, real world, real politic, right? So in the list of unclean animals, where the Torah defines what is kosher and what is not kosher. So in the list of unclean animals, the translators wrote for King Ptolemy, the short-legged beast, Tze'irat haragaleim, and they did not write for him, and the hare, like a rabbit, the arnevet. Why didn't they say the arnevet? Because the name of Ptolemy's wife was Arnevet, so that he would not say, the Jews have mocked me and inserted my wife's name in their Torah among the list of unclean animals. They used a euphemism for the hare so that you would understand that, rabbits and hares are not kosher to eat, but without using a word that happened to also be the name of the queen. The Mishna cites that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. And Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the law, the halacha, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And Rabban Yochanan said, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? He based his opinion on an allusion in the Torah, as the verse states, God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. These are the sons of Noah. The Jews come from Shem. Others come from Japheth. In the Greek Empire is understood to descend from Japheth, indicating that the words of Japheth shall be in the tents of Shem. The language of Javan, who is the forebear of the Greek nation and one of the descendants of Japheth, will also serve as a sacred language within the tents of Shem, where Torah is studied. That's how Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel came to say that you could write a sacred Torah scroll in Greek. And the Gemara asks and say that it is the language of Gomer and Magog that serve as sacred languages, as they too were descendants of Japheth. And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said, this is the reason, as it is written, God shall enlarge Yaft Japheth, Yephet. Yaft is etymologically similar to the Hebrew word for beauty, Yofi, and the verse teaches that the beauty of Japheth shall be in the tents of Shem, and Greek is the most beautiful of the language of the descendants of Japheth. So what is the law? With regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. On that line, here where's the law ended up. The halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who permitted the Torah to be written in Greek, and it has the sanctity of a Torah scroll, due to the fact that the modern Greek language is not the Greek discussed in the Gemara. Torah scrolls written in Greek are no longer sacred. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 10. Mishnah number 11. The difference between a high priest anointed with the oil of anointing, which was the method through which high priests were consecrated until the oil was sequestered toward the end of the first temple period. Recall that when it became clear that the first temple was going to be destroyed by the hordes of Nebuchadnezzar, the king at that time hid certain things that have never been located since, like the Ark of the Covenant, like the jar of manna that was preserved from the desert, and the oil that Moses collected, and just very little of it was ever used over the next, many hundreds of years, 800 years, only when they needed to anoint a high priest or, I believe, a king. But once that oil went into hiding, we didn't have it anymore. So in the second temple period, we still had high priests, but they were consecrated to their role of a high priest simply by donning the garments of the high priest. There no longer was the oil. So what this Mishnah is about is, okay, well, was there any difference, legally speaking, between priests who were anointed as the Torah prescribes, that they should be anointed with the oil of anointing, versus the later high priests of the second temple period, which, were high priests in every way, except they had not been anointed with that oil. So what legal significance does it have that they weren't anointed with that oil? The difference between a high priest anointed with the oil of anointing and a priest consecrated by donning the multiple garments unique to a high priest is only that the priests of the second temple period, who were consecrated just by putting on the garments, the difference between them is that the bull that comes for the transgression of any of the mitzvahs. In other words, an anointed high priest, and one who is acting as the high priest, he's anointed, who unwittingly issued an erroneous legal ruling, a halachic ruling, and he acted upon that ruling, and he transgressed a commandment of the Torah, whose unwitting violation renders one liable to bring a sin offering. So in that situation, a priest anointed with the anointing oil brings a bull offering, special offering for that situation. He relied on his own understanding of the law. He was wrong. He committed a transgression based on his legal ruling. He didn't do it on purpose, but now he has to bring a sin offering. That situation, he brings the bull offering. But only the priests of the first temple period would do that, and earlier, the priests of the tabernacle, who were anointed with the anointing oil. Priests of the second temple period, this law did not apply to them. In every other way, priests from before the anointing oil was lost and after are the same in every way. And the difference between a high priest who is currently serving in that capacity and a former high priest. So we had that situation in Tractate Yuma, the laws of Yom Kippur, as we learned how the high priest would prepare to serve on Yom Kippur. But then what happened if he got sick? He got COVID, God forbid, or something like that, and he couldn't serve on Yom Kippur. Well, the nation needed a high priest at Yom Kippur, so they would elevate one of the other priests to become high priest. Then the first high priest gets better. Who's now the high priest? What do we do in that situation? The original high priest becomes the high priest again. But this guy who got elevated to be high priest, even if only for one day, he can't be demoted to be a regular priest again. So what do we do with him? Now the Mishnah is saying the only difference between the high priest who's currently serving in that role and one who was a high priest temporarily, what is the difference between them? The only difference between them is with regard to the bull brought by the high priest on Yom Kippur and the tenth of an ephah meal offering, which is brought every day when the temple is standing by the high priest. Those two offerings can be brought only by the current high priest and not by a former high priest. But as you see, a former high priest could do any other function on any other day, even Yom Kippur, I guess. He could do anything that a high priest can do, but he can't do those two things. Time is short, so we are going to skip to Mishnah number 12. We're at the bottom of page 9b. This is the last Mishnah we're going to cover today, and a very short Gemara. Mishnah number 12. The difference between a great public altar, such as the altars established at Nov and Gibeon, which served as religious centers following the destruction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in Shiloh. Right? So in the desert during the 40 years of wandering, we had the tabernacle, and that's where the priests served, Aaron and his sons served and brought the offerings on behalf of the Jewish people. And then Joshua led the children of Israel into the land of Israel. And for hundreds of years, so the tabernacle stood in Shiloh. Eventually, it was destroyed. At that time, they built other altars so that people could bring their offerings. And they were built at Nov and Gibeon. Okay, so the only difference between those altars and small personal altars. Now, the Jews are not allowed to build private altars when there is an altar in Jerusalem, or when there is a central altar for the Jewish people, and not since the temples were destroyed. So that we don't have private altars, but there was a short periods of history where private altars were permitted. So what's the difference between public altars that are not in the Mishkan or in the temple, and private altars during the times that they are permitted? What is the difference between them? The only difference is with regard to the Pesach, the Paschal lamb brought at Passover, which may not be sacrificed on a small altar, may only be sacrificed on a public altar. This is the principle. Any offering that is vowed or contributed voluntarily is sacrificed on a small altar, and any offering that is neither vowed nor contributed voluntarily, but rather is compulsory, for example, a sin offering that you have to bring if you commit a certain kind of transgression, the compulsory offerings are not brought on small altars. Small altars are only for voluntary offerings, and they are not permitted during most periods in Jewish history. The Gemara on this, and then I'm coming to your questions and comments in a moment. The Gemara asks, is the difference only with respect to Paschal lambs and nothing more? The continuation of the Mishna indicates that there are additional differences, and the Gemara answers, say that the difference between them is only with regard to the offerings that are similar to Paschal lambs because they are obligatory. And the Gemara asks, according to whose opinion is the Mishna taught? And the Gemara answers, it is taught according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says, even the public sacrificed only Paschal lambs and compulsory offerings for which there is a set time, like fixed communal offerings. However, compulsory offerings for which there is not a set time, like a sin offering, right? The people must bring, and the nation must bring daily offerings, the nation must bring the Passover offerings, but sin offerings they're obligatory, but only when a person happens to have committed the transgression that triggers the obligation to bring the sin offering. So for those offerings which do not have compulsory offerings which do not have a set time, they are sacrificed neither on the small altar nor on the great altar. They may be sacrificed only in the temple. That's what we've got today. All right, let's go to questions or comments. Oh, and by the way, should have mentioned this earlier. A few days ago, we were discussing Tiberias, and I said a couple of times that it's on the coast, and then I mentioned the Mediterranean coast. What was I thinking? I mean, we spoke often enough, I think in Tractate Eruvin, about the fact that Tiberia, is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, not on the Mediterranean. Thank you, Spencer Ehrman, for pointing that out to me. But Caesarea is on the Mediterranean coast. All right, let's go to questions and comments. Tom, with regard to taking a vow not to benefit from another person, why would a person take such a vow? Enmity, which really should be worked out. Very interesting, right? So like we see that kind of language in the Torah and in the Bible elsewhere. You know, like Abraham says, it will not be said that I took a shoe strap from going into this war, right? Abraham went to war with his men to save his nephew Lot during the war of the 5 kings versus the 4 kings. And he didn't want to say that anyone should say that he was enriched by that he was in some way a mercenary, commander taking his soldiers into battle. That kind of idea that I will not be enriched, I will not benefit from this person. So yes, certainly, Tom, that would seem to be one reason, right? You just don't want to have anything to do with that person. You want to benefit from him in any way. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe there's other reasons why somebody might say that. You have this impulse in the youth that they want to, at least in former ages and times, that the youth would say, I don't want to benefit at all from the older generation. I want to be independent and, be my own man. I don't want to do anything by inheritance. I want to do it myself. Maybe that's a situation where they would take that vow. I don't have any other, information on your question offhand. Sharon, I recently taught a class to students about the mitzvah, the commandment of the obligation of vows. My understanding is that most pledges are made bli neder, right? When someone pledges to give to charity, he'll say bli neder, like I'm not taking a legal vow according to Torah law. Absolutely right. Without making a vow to avoid the risks of obligations associated with vows mentioned. Was that not the general practice at the time of this Mishnah? I don't know. Now, me talking about pledges of charity, I'm talking about in a spiritual sense. You're absolutely right. It doesn't have the same kind of a vow, like I vow before the Lord that I'm going to do such and such. No. But I am saying that, and like here in our community, people take that very seriously. Like if you make a pledge, like for instance, when we auction off an honor during the holidays as a fundraiser for the temple, you don't want to have that pledge on your personal ledger, as it were. And God forbid something should happen to you when you arrive in heaven with unpaid pledges, right? But you're absolutely right. It doesn't have the same force as the kind of vows that we're talking here. And particularly the vows, for example, an Erechin vow, somebody says, I will bring my personal valuation as a gift in the temple. Those kinds of vows had a stronger force when the temple was standing. So definitely we distinguish modern pledges from those kinds of vows. And now Sharon's asking, well, the pledges they're talking about here in the Gemara, are they more like modern pledges or like those ancient vows? I would say it's like those ancient vows. That's why they're talking about it. Because they're talking specifically about a pledge to bring an offering. And the idea that if you wait too long, then you become guilty of that transgression of not fulfilling your vow because too much time has passed. Yosef, I studied a religion known as Gnosticism. Early Christians viewed them as heretics, but what was being described about this pre-God entity that created God sounds like the Gnostic God. Interesting. I don't have any personal knowledge of that, but thank you for sharing. Gwen, what peoples came from Ham? Right, so that was the other son of Noah. I don't know. I'm sorry. I should have looked that up. But there was this idea, right? So after, the descendants of Noah, and then if you look in the Torah with commentary, probably you can find this in Sefaria, maybe Rashi goes into it, sort of who comes from who. But there was the, cursed will be Canaan, right? That was one of the sons. Maybe that's Ham. And that they would be slaves because he looked on the nakedness of his father, right? The other two sons sort of protected Noah's modesty, and Ham did something I'm not sure about. But I'm probably misspeaking right now because I didn't brush up on that story. I should know better. Gwen. That was Gwen's question. And Sharon, finally, I would imagine that linguistic comfort would have been greater with the Septuagint than Torah, especially with all the understandings other than the Peshat understanding for non-Jews, especially outside of Israel. I think what I'm hearing you say, Sharon, is that the Septuagint traveled much further in the world because it was much more accessible. I mean, a translation into Greek at the time of the mighty Greek Empire was, like being translated into English today. It made it accessible to everybody. That's what the sages were worried about, right? Because once they translated it into Greek, they had to make certain choices because there were words in Hebrew that could have multiple meanings, that had nuanced meanings. Now, when you put that into Greek, you're going to have to decide which of those meanings is being carried in the translation. And then other meanings are lost, and certain inferences are going to be made. And that was the danger. And so that's why we went through a bunch of the changes that the translators made to protect the original intent of God in transmitting the Torah to us. But Hebrew, difficult, moody language, has fewer words than a lot of other languages. And so a lot of these moody and nuanced meanings emerge from that. And if you don't have that background and that halakhic understanding of what these things mean. So a verse like, let us make man in our image, what does that mean, right? Who is God talking to? Let us make man. And, the one thing for sure is like the most fundamental principle of Torah is that there is one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So if God is speaking in the first person plural, what does he mean? And to understand that, you go into, some of this more esoteric, mystical understanding of how God created the world. God created the first band of angels. This great story that we're going to come to, later in our journey. It's just one of my favorites. God told the angels he was going to make. I'm not going to tell that story today. It's late in the day. We're already over an hour. I can see. Nina's in the house, but I'm sure she's saying salad's enough. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for Daf Yud, page 10 here in Tractate Megillah. Have a great night.